Hi, everybody. Welcome along today to the Indigenous and Transcultural Research Centre seminar series. I'm really glad that you're able to join us today. We have an amazing presenter with an amazing topic today that I think we're all going to have learn much from. I'd like to kick off with an acknowledgement of country and in fact a celebration of country. I'm coming to you today from Gubbi Gubbi country here on the Sunshine Coast, and I acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands of the lands from which you are zooming in from today. Country is such a special part of our lives. It enriches our research, it supports us, it rejuvenates and regenerates us so that we can continue to make a difference in the world. Today we have Associate Professor Marnee Shay joining us from the University of Queensland. I'll just read Marnee's biography and then we'll kick off with the presentation. So Marnee's presentation today is Emancipatory Methodologies, Amplifying Indigenous Voices Through Research. Associate Professor Marnee Shay is an Aboriginal researcher with whose maternal family is from Wagaman country in the Daly River in Northern Territory. She is from the N'gandu language group. Marnee was born in Brisbane and has strong connections to Indigenous communities in southeast Queensland. Dr. Shay has an extensive external research funding program and has many publications across fields of Indigenous education policy and flexi schooling. She is a chief investigator on the ITRC Centre of Excellence for Indigenous Futures and an associate investigator at the Australian Research Centre for the Digital Child. Marnee advocates for a strengths-based approach in Indigenous education and Indigenous-based evidence to inform policy futures. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Marnee. Thanks, Marnee.
Thanks very much, Maria. And thanks to you all for taking the time to join us today. As is protocol, I'd also like to acknowledge country. So I'm on Europal country today. In my home office, which is in the Lockyer Valley west of Brisbane. And I'd also like to acknowledge the deadly artists you can see in my background and also on the screen. So two Quandamooka artists, Casey Coolwell and Kyra Magtalo, did some beautiful designs for our reconciliation artwork at UQ. So I hope you can enjoy that while you're listening today as well. And I also want to acknowledge, I just saw Auntie Judy's face, zoom in. So Auntie, I didn't get away with this one, did I? But I want to acknowledge our elders especially. So a bit about me, I want to acknowledge Gubbi Gubbi country as well, Gubbi Gubbi country, because I grew up in the community there. So Auntie Judy and like many elders from our community up the coast have played a big part in shaping who I am. And so some of the work that I'm going to talk to you about today. So Maria talked to you about who I am. So I'm Aboriginal on my mum's side. Our mob's from Daly River in the southern Daly region. So I'm a Scully and a Cummings for any other mob that are tuned in today. And I also have Scottish and English ancestry on my dad's side. But I was raised by my mum, so my Aboriginality has played a big part in shaping my career journey. So I'm a registered secondary school teacher, and I've got just over 20 years experience across diverse educational settings. And as Maria mentioned, I'm presently a principal research fellow at UQ, where I've been for just over 6 years now. So a brief overview, I'm going to talk today, I'm going to open the session just with a little bit of reflection about the concept of Indigenous voices and Indigenous research. I'm going to talk to you about collaborative yarning methodology, which I developed from my doctoral work, and also some new research that I'm working on around co-design. So before I start the session today, I think it's important to pause and reflect on the moment we're in. So last year, we lived through a referendum that took a proposal to the Australian public to alter the Constitution to enshrine Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices through political mechanisms, particularly in matters that affect us. We all know that Australia voted no. We know not all Australians felt this way, but we know it was a majority. Post-referendum, I know a lot of our people, people in my family and my community, are still devastated by the result. And there's a sense of feeling like we are stuck in the place that we are currently in. If a minor change to the Constitution to allow our people to have a say on matters that affect us was voted down, other mechanisms such as treaty seem even further out of reach, at least within my lifetime. So I don't want to start today's session on a somber note, but rather acknowledge where we are in relation to the concept of Indigenous voices. I wrote an opinion piece for Routledge during Reconciliation Week last year, when I was asked to reflect upon what Be a Voice for Generations meant to me. In the article, I talk about how important it is to recognise and pay our respects to our elders and ancestors, because without their hardships, advocacy, voices, and staunch resistance, we would not be in the place we are in today, even though it's not where we want to be. I also talk about how hard I have worked in developing as a researcher to think critically and in an ongoing way about the notion of voice, particularly as I now occupy a space of great privilege, that is, a space of knowledge production. So voice isn't a hierarchy neutral concept. As researchers, we are granted authority to design research to include and exclude different voices on various topics. How different voices are perceived as being important or not is on the authority of the person seeking them. The scholarship of Professor Linda Tuuwai-Smith, Professor Morton Robinson, Professor Lester Irabina-Rigney, for example, laid the foundations for understanding the role of research in producing and reproducing particular discourses about Indigenous peoples that have been harmful to our people and our communities. So as researchers, we all bring our own preconceived ideas about voice, whether you are Indigenous or non-Indigenous. That means that the theories, methodologies, and methods for analysis and all aspects of research practice are at high stakes in Indigenous research settings. In the session today, I will share two aspects of my work that have helped break down barriers for diverse Indigenous participation, with the aim of increasing Indigenous voices in research. The first is a methodology I developed for my doctoral research called collaborative yarning methodology, and some recent work that I've been developing with colleagues on co-design. So when I commenced my PhD in 2014 on the experiences of Indigenous practitioners in flexi schools, I knew I needed a methodology that was culturally fit for purpose. Having been a teacher in flexi schools before I commenced the research, I knew that yarning would be the most appropriate way to work with mob in my research context. After reading all of the scholarship on yarning, particularly Bessarab and N'gandu's 2010 renowned paper, Yarning About Yarning as a Legitimate Method in Indigenous Research, I knew yarning would be how I approached data collection. But as I thought more deeply about how I would collect the data, I became concerned about the only option being put forward in the literature as audio recording. I knew inherently from my Aboriginal family and community, as well as the professional roles I had undertaken with community and in flexi schools, that bringing out an audio recorder in the middle of a yarn, in the middle of a yarn had the potential to exclude people from the research, and therefore I may miss important voices in that research. I also knew that every person's experience of yarning would be different based on the individual's culture, background, and connections, as well as being different in each context, and that it may form part of my contribution if collaborative yarning methodology achieves what I hoped it would. Collaborative yarning methodology utilizes yarning and storyboarding as methods of data collection, which incorporate cross-checking and analysis within the data collection process. So principles of collaborative yarning methodology So collaborative yarning methodology builds on existing scholarship by yarning scholars. So some of those scholars I've cited there in the PowerPoint. So it's framed on relationality, or it's underpinned by relationality. It's about creating and building connections. And we know that it's more than a conversation or an interview. So through relationality, it embodies storytelling through Indigenous knowledge paradigms, as well as ensuring active listening is just as important as sharing. So collaborative yarning methodology builds on this earlier work by recognising that while our relationalities are a strength, it can also mean mediating different issues when you're Indigenous, navigating different Indigenous settings. So for example, in our communities, sometimes there are different cultural protocols around gender and age, and whether direct sharing is appropriate. Collaborative yarning methodology is also framed by the principles outlined in Figure 1. So through story, knowledge, and relationships, knowledge is shared that includes the past, the present, and the future. It can also include the political and ideological, as well as through and by self, family, and community. So the yarning scholarship to date had reported data collection methods for yarning as being audio recording and transcriptions of those recordings. Some authors reported that taking these back to people, and others didn't mention specific processes related to data collection and analysis. So collaborative yarning methodology departs from the notion that audio recording is the most accurate way to capture people's stories and perspectives. In the collaborative yarning methodology paper I published, I analysed the over-reliance on audio recording and unpacked the paradigmatic arguments about the practice of audio recording, particularly in using the most similar method of data collection, interviews. So interview methodology scholarship often engages in a debate between constructivism and positivism. So positivist research caution against using interviews to study human experience, arguing that the subjective nature of storytelling compromises objectivity of behavioural and interactive analysis. Conversely, Punch asserts that interviews in qualitative research effectively uncover people's perceptions, meanings, and constructions of reality, advocating for a constructivist approach to understanding human experiences. So I use a lot of Professor David Silverman's work, and he contends that the constructivist researchers view interviews as a means to authentically capture participants' voices and perspectives on specific issues and groups. However, he also critiques that persistent reliance on or over-reliance on interview data, arguing that it is inherently influenced by social context, challenging the positivist notion of objectivity and validity. And thus the belief that audio recordings capture responses verbatim loses credibility when viewed through a constructivist lens. So regardless of a researcher's philosophical stance, audio or video recording remains the most common method for collecting interview data, as it did by researchers using yarning. So I then needed to consider other methods for data collection that honoured the principles of yarning and further considered other ethical issues in Indigenous research, such as Indigenous self-determination. I came across the work of Professor Kaz Stewart from the University of Cumbria, who had written extensively on data collection methods for practitioners as well as marginalised young people in her community. So I adopted some of this work, particularly a concept called storyboarding. So storyboarding is a textual recording of research discussions. When I considered its use in Indigenous research settings, I wanted to ensure it enabled the use of multiple languages and Indigenous symbols and imagery. The textual recordings need to be on a large piece of paper that enables all of the room to see what is being recorded in a transparent way. This increases accountability and accuracy around what is being recorded. There are also, the data is also cross-checked at multiple phases throughout the data collection process. That's often termed member checking in the research literature. So research topics or questions need to be visual in the room. I'm just shifting to sort of a more practical application of this now. So this practice is for transparency, but it also gives people a chance to think and reflect before the yarns commence. So as Bessarab and N'gandu articulate, ensuring enough time to do the social and connecting yarns before starting with the research is very important. This is in line with Indigenous cultural protocols and ensures the person or group knows who you are, how you are related, where you come from, and what you do. It's important not to rush these conversations. So during this time, ensuring there is informal time to yarn about the research, about what is involved, and so people can ask those questions during that yarning time. Explaining the methodology is also very important. So one of the motivations for me to develop the methodology was how positive the feedback was from mob about how we were going about the research. I actually had people in tell me that if I had have been audio recording, then they wouldn't have actually participated in the research. So large sheets of paper, so the ones that stick on the wall are the best, that have the research yarning topics, or they could be questions, and blank ones for textual recordings are needed, and I have it all set up before the session. Responses can be tagged as individual or group responses. So this detail is important for many mob because we often like to be in a group setting. However, for accuracy, it does need to be distinguished if the perspective is from an individual or from multiple people or from an entire group. That's really important in terms of data recording, integrity of the data, and data analysis. So the codes for responses can be initials or they can be names. I've used both in different settings. This can be clarified by the researcher as responses are recorded. And at the end of each topic, I revisit each response and ensure it is recorded accurately. From my experience, this process is very important because there are numerous times across several projects now where people have said, change this or please add something. So it's really important to allow for that time and space to have those yarns as well. So benefits, challenges, and considerations. As mentioned earlier, the main benefit of collaborative yarning methodology is opening up opportunities for participation that would have been closed to people who would find being audio recorded intimidating or uncomfortable. So from my experience using collaborative yarning methodology across multiple projects, this is more people than you would anticipate. I have had lots of feedback from people who did participate that they liked it and they felt like it created a sense of community. So it clearly does increase the comfort of mob participating in research. Although it is more resource intensive in some ways, not having many pages of transcripts that often are included in what Bessarab and N'gandu talk about as meandering yarning, that's a benefit in terms of the quality of the data that you end up with. So it ends up being reliable data, especially because it has already been checked by participants and approved by participants in situ. And it then doesn't include all of the social yarns that sometimes people don't really want recorded anyway. Challenges and considerations. Collaborative yarning methodology takes considerably more time than other ways of collecting data. An interview may take 20 to 40 minutes, and collaborative yarning methodology takes double that time. So many researchers don't have that sort of time, and on this basis alone won't wouldn't use collaborative yarning methodology. But for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers, ethics and cultural well-being takes priority, so we have to incorporate this in the time. It's something we don't really have a choice about if we're working with community. So even when using ostensibly fast methods such as interviews, the yarning and connecting often means you spend more time with people anyway. It takes considerably more energy and concentration to facilitate collaborative yarning methodology. So my PhD workshop, for example, went across an entire day and I was exhausted by the end of it. I was lucky to have access to staff that were at a national gathering anyway, and they had the choice to attend my whole day session or go to another part of the conference. So that actually took away the issue of remuneration because their schools saw the research as valuable and were happy to support attendance. But the other consideration in terms of using collaborative yarning methodology, as in any other Indigenous research setting, is ensuring people are appropriately remunerated for their time and expertise and what they're sharing with you. So, you know, not expecting to take people's time for free just because what, you know, you're researching may benefit Indigenous people as a whole. You have to think about what people are giving up to share, you know, their knowledge with you. So I'm just going to shift to co-design in research now. So co-design is a bit of a buzzword at the moment in Indigenous policy. In research, it is most closely aligned with participatory approaches. So with I've got colleagues across all teams, but I'll just shout out to Professor Grace Sara here because we work across multiple projects. So we are exploring how Indigenous people conceive of effective co-design in both research and educational practice settings. So despite co-design being named as the approach for developing the voice and increasingly other policy settings, there's sort of very little evidence around what effective co-design looks like in shifting outcomes for mob. In seeking to understand if there is a cohesive definition in co-design in Indigenous settings, we recently undertook and published a systematic literature review on co-design in Indigenous education contexts. So I'm talking specifically about education settings here. But we found that there were only 15 papers published on the topic. We examined the papers to understand how co-design is being talked about, from conceptualization to process to evaluation. 9 of those papers did not even define co-design. We also found that currently most co-design is not being implemented at the beginning phase of the project. We also found that currently it appears that co-design doesn't necessarily result in enabling Indigenous leadership, with only 33% of the papers demonstrating evidence of this. 47% of the papers did show evidence of shared decision-making, but as co-design suggests, a co or both input approach, it was expected that most, if not all, papers would have shown this. So our emergent data from 2 research projects on co-design is showing that Indigenous people conceive of co-design as a genuine partnership where Indigenous voices are centred. Some other principles to emerge from our practices and observations of where co-design that enables Indigenous voice and leadership are ensuring co-design happens at conception of a project. So problem location is key here, and the key to whether a project is co-design lies in this detail. We found there is a divergence in how schools and governments see co-design and how Indigenous people and communities see co-design. An example of why this detail is important is if there is a school who has decided attendance is a key problem for the school, and they then go to the community and say they want to co-design a program to address it. But that very same community says that the issue is a handful of teachers saying racist things towards their children at school. So to the community, the issue is teacher conduct, but to the school, the issue is attendance. So for a project to be truly co-designed, the school needs to go with an open agenda to say, you know, we want to help improve outcomes for, you know, the children and young people. And, you know, we want to co-design some approaches to that rather than saying we have a problem, we want to solve it, let's develop a solution together. That's more of a consultative approach. Further principles include enabling Indigenous leadership in an attempt to address power differentials that pre-exist the process, ensuring there are mechanisms to meet regularly throughout the process, and ensuring there is some form of evaluation. And we know that you know, the lack of evaluation on programs and policies a problem. So co-design in Indigenous research settings radically departs from how research is approached in most universities. Research topics or projects are usually conceived of by the researcher, and then partners are sought depending on the nature of the research. Applying co-design in Indigenous research settings means working with research partners to develop an understanding of problems the community wants to address through research and designing a program from there. An example of a project where co-design was applied is a recent project we completed that was funded by AIATSIS, and the project was called Binang Manadu, Cultural Stories and Living Histories on Waka Waka Country. So my colleague, Professor Grace Sarah, and me were invited by the Waka Waka Elders Group attached to the local high school to develop an idea that would help support Waka Waka language revitalisation that was happening there in the school. And I should add that we have long-term existing relationships and had worked previously with these partners. But the idea was to develop contemporary cultural resources to support Waka Waka language curriculum. So many existing Indigenous studies resources are generic and don't reflect local knowledges and perspectives. So there was a recognition of the existing strengths and knowledges from within the community, and the idea was to develop these knowledges into digital and written stories to be used on Waka Waka country. From there, we applied for funding that happened to be available at that time, and we were subsequently successful in receiving that funding. We worked with various key organisations in the community, including Cherbourg State School, Mergen State High School, Cherbourg Aboriginal Shire Council, N'gandu Early Childhood Centre, and Cherbourg Radio. We had a Waka Waka person join the team, Fred Cobbo, and he was a chief investigator on the team. And Fred also lives in the community of Cherbourg, and you know, this supported the project being community driven and sustainable. For example, the digital stories developed to support the language curriculum are located and managed by the Aboriginal Cherbourg Aboriginal Shire Council, where all storytellers own their intellectual property, and they'll be governed and managed by the community elected council for the longer term. So Fred remains the contact person in the community because he was the chief investigator. But it just sort of shows that, you know, there's a lot of practices in and around co-design that are very much about ensuring that, you know, governance and ownership remain in the community. The outcomes from this project were high impact. So we had 13 video stories, a podcast series, and written stories, including stories from young people. We also developed 2 bilingual books written by children and young people, and the stories are now in English and Waka Waka language, and they're being used in classrooms in those communities. We held a community forum to celebrate the outcomes from the project, where we had approximately 50 people from the community attend the celebration, and we believe the outcomes of the project were so impactful because of the application of co-design across the life of the project. So I'm just going to give you a further example of where we use co-design, but we didn't we weren't able to use it across the entirety of the project. So you are able to use co-design or principles of co-design through various aspects of research. So I just want to give you that example as well. So this research project focused on the voices of Indigenous young people, identity, wellbeing and schooling. And we use co-design with young people as a way of amplifying their voices that were quite absent from the literature and public discourse at that time. So we use co-design with young people to develop an artifact from the research. There were no restrictions on what they could do within their budget, but it had to be an artifact that reflected their thoughts and participation in that particular research. So through the process of the research, which included a series of workshops in collaboration with local Indigenous researchers, the young people were given time to engage deeply with the research topics to culminate in their co-design project. The outcome of using co-design in this context is that we had young people write and record rap songs with film clips, design clothing with slogans that spoke to their experiences of being an Indigenous young person. And although in this example, the research team did design the topic, in providing young people the space to lead the process and development of their artifact, provided outcomes that their schools and communities were surprised by. So many of the young people were termed disengaged, and yet they were highly engaged in this process that made the space to listen to them and their perspectives. And the lesson here is providing space for listening to diverse perspectives is critical if we are seeking them. And I just want to point out the design on this slide is one of the designs from one of the sites. And the young people did that artwork with an elder, and it told the story of, their identities and coming together for this project. And they also came up with the slogan, strive with pride, which you can see is connected to the research project and identity. So co-design benefits, challenges, and considerations. There are many benefits to using co-design. Most distinctly from our experience in research, we have found that co-design has a high impact because it draws from the expertise of the community in knowing what topics and projects are the most urgent for that community. Other benefits include bringing diverse Indigenous voices into the process through enabling Indigenous leadership. Projects can result in better outcomes and building sustainability. When mob are driving the process and heavily involved, we often think about sustainability because while researchers come and go, that is where people live and are connected. And they often think about the longer term in ways that people who are not from the community can't. So similarly to collaborative yarning methodology, our co-design is resource intensive. We visited the community many times prior to receiving funding, and we funded this ourselves. A further challenge and consideration is, what if we didn't get the funding, which is the reality for most competitive, research grants, where we know success rates are low. So people have invested time and resources in developing the ideas, as well as the emotional aspect of the prospect of getting something exciting happening for the community. And if you don't receive the funding, it can take years to continue trying. And then sometimes, these ideas can lose momentum. So that is a risk in a sense. So finally, critical reflections on research practices will support better practices to enhance and centre the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in research. In the absence of a national Indigenous voice, it is imperative now that researchers consider the ways in which we incorporate Indigenous voices into our research, especially if it is of interest and relevance to Indigenous people and communities, but even more so if it is about us. So I've shared 2 methodologies I've been using and developing in my work, and I hope it's been useful for anyone considering how to elevate Indigenous voices in your research practices. Thank you. that's the end.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Marnee. Might just end the recording at that